Carburetors with four-corner idle mixture screws might seem a little complicated to adjust, but in reality, they aren't too bad. But there are a couple little details that you need to know before you get started, so let's go. Before we go through this on the GMC truck and do some adjustments, show you how it's done, let's just talk really quickly about why you would need a four-core idle or why it's used. And the reason is really simple. The more aggressive the cam profile you have in the engine, the more control you want, and the harder it is to adjust idle speed, simply because the amount of air that needs to go through there with the transfer slots open as much as they are, you're trying to control and give it a little bit more air, but also try to control the speed, control the fuel mixture going through there. And sometimes that becomes a dance that you just can't find a good partner for. So it's really based around that. Now, can you use a four-core idle system on a mild or a stock application? Sure. Typically, a lot of times what most folks do, instead of just adjusting the primaries, they will close the secondaries off completely and then open the idle air or idle speed screw or close it completely. That way you're not transferring any fuel on the secondary side, and it's quite all right. So don't worry if you've got a really mild application. The GMC truck certainly isn't super aggressive. It's actually kind of mild in most instances, but it does react well when it has a four-corner idle on it. Fortunately, I've had the VRS on there and done some test videos on that. Those are coming up pretty soon, but for today, I'm not sure which one will run on the car. Probably this one, just simply because I just built it, and it does require some setup, and it's going to require some tuning before I kick it out the door and send it off somebody else. So with that being said, let's show you some of the setup and some of the things that you'll need to do prior to putting this on the engine so you can have a good, successful operation. Now, like any other carburetor adjustment, this is not going to work if you have other issues. Ignition timing is certainly the biggest obstacle when it comes to making adjustments or playing with a carburetor, because that is the basis of everything that's going on in the engine. This is just feeding that. So if your timing is really low at 4, 6, or 8 degrees before top dead center, generally in most instances, you need to increase that and add some more timing. I'm down here a little closer to sea level, about 500 foot above, and I'm around 12 to 14 everywhere where I start. So I believe the GMC truck is at 16. That just tells you it's got a little bit more aggressive cam. Just needs a little bit more time to start that burning process. So I run 16. It seems to be perfect. So timing is a big one. A neglected ignition system. If you've got wires or a cap or rotor or ignition box, whatever you're using that's not quite operating properly, it doesn't matter what you do on the tuning side on the carburetor, you're not going to get the best result out of it. Improper fuel system. If you don't have good filters and it's constantly sending garbage to the carburetor, that's a huge deal. Too much or not enough fuel pressure. Another big factor that a lot of folks just say, well, I've got a stock pump on there. It doesn't really need a pressure regulator. You've heard me preach about that 1,000 times if you've watched any of my videos. A regulator is one of the best add-ons you can add to a fuel system, because now it allows you to control how much pressure the carburetor sees instead of just hoping that the pump is going to give it the right amount of pressure, and allow you to adjust as needed. So those are the key things. Now let's talk about initial carburetor setup, some of the things you need to do before this thing even gets bolted on. This is a brand new build. It's got a lot of new components, pieces, metering blocks, throttle plate. There's a lot of new components on here, but you need to make sure the carburetor's clean and ready to be in service. If it's not, if you've got issues, if it's dirty, filthy, you bolt it on, you don't know anything about it, it's a good idea to just knock it apart really quick, take a look, make sure that you've got a good serviceable carburetor. Choke needs to be working properly. If it's not, if it's an electric choke, now this one happens to be a manual choke carburetor, a little different, so it's not quite that complicated. But if you are a electric choke carburetor, you need to make sure that when the engine is warmed up, that the choke is fully open. So that's also another big part of it. another thing is before you even put this on, we're going to do a couple of things that are really super critical. So first thing to do is now you're going to get a lot of different people telling you different things. Set these from all the way seated to 3/4 of a turn out. Some people will tell you a turn and a half, turn and a quarter, whatever the case may be. I typically, because this is a little bit milder engine, I'm going to start at a turn completely out from seated. Do it on all four corners. And the reason why I do that is from there, I can make adjustments either way, and it's not going to be overly rich. If I go a turn and a half, I'm going to guess it's probably going to be a little too rich for this engine. So in this case, I want to go a full turn on each one should be just fine. Let's talk about balancing the throttle plates. And what that really means is when you have a four corner setup and you can set the idle speed or idle air, the amount of air that goes past the throttle plates into the engine, you need to set these about the same. Now at idle, I try to keep these typically the way most folks do. Now with the transfer slots, I kind of set that a little bit by eye, but for the most part, what most folks will tell you that there's a certain measurement that they go by, and that's all well and good, but for the most part, most people are not going to be able to get a gauge down in there to measure it. So what you do is if you square off the transfer slots, it's generally a good place to start. Now that may not be where you end up based on any adjustments that you make to the speed screw or the air screw. So just be ready to or understand that if you get to that point and you're completely done on the idle side, you go out and drive it, and you have a little bit of that hesitation off idle through rolling into 15, 16, 1800 RPM and beyond, rolling through that, it could be that the transfer slots aren't exposed enough. Now, the Holley generally likes to have that little bit more fuel being metered through the system and adding more fuel through the transfer slot to allow it to make that transition from idle into the main metering circuit where the fuel is now flowing in through the boosters. So just be conscious of that. I guess it may require you to have the carburetor on and off a couple of times, but we're going to assume and make the assumption that once we set these to square, we'll be good to go, and then we can make those small adjustments, and it shouldn't affect it too much. Again, this is a little bit milder engine, so I don't anticipate that we're going to have any issues with it, but you can also make adjustments to the accelerator pump. The Holley has a lot of good adjustment points, so you can kind of take those out of there, and Holleys generally flow a lot more fuel anyway. So really balancing those plates is really a good thing to do. If you don't do that, you're kind of set with guessing where it's at once it gets on the engine. Last but not least is an AFR gauge. If you have an AFR, it is a good tool to have when you're doing this process. Not completely necessary. You can kind of do this by the sound of the engine, how the vacuum is pulling, and what the idle RPM is. So you don't really need one. The nice thing about having an AR when you're setting idle mixture is really you can watch those changes to the AFR live. Once you're making these adjustments to the idle mixture screws, it's really cool to watch it on the AFR because you tell if you are at too lean of an idle, too rich of an idle. And generally, I don't go super lean at idle because typically that's when you run into a lot of problems with heat. And certainly a lean condition there isn't a good thing. So anywhere around 13.8, 13.9, 14.0 is a good spot. If you're trying to get super lean at idle, you're really not gaining a whole lot. I understand the thought process of not trying to use a lot of fuel, keeping the engine clean, keeping the spark plugs clean. Completely understand all of that, but it doesn't really need to be that lean. Now, again, you're going to have a lot of different opinions on that. So if you've got one that you like, at idle, leave it down in the comments below. Tell me where you like to set your idle AFR. If it's 13.5, I'm not going to argue with you. If that's what the engine wants, then that's what you need to give it. So that's what it is. But for this demonstration, we're not going to use an AFR gauge. We're just going to show you as it is and show you how to make the adjustments. So now let's talk real quick about the tools you're going to need to make this happen. Now, you don't need a lot of tools to do this. good vacuum gauge that we're going to hook up to manifold vacuum. We'll talk about that a little bit when we get out to the engine. A timing light. Now, you're not really going to play with timing. You don't need to when you're setting the idle mixture screws. You can, certainly, if you feel like a little bit more timing is necessary. I don't discourage that. In fact, I encourage it strongly. But having a timing light that has the ability to read RPM under hood is a really, really critical thing. I love having both there. That way I can see as you're making adjustments on the mixture screws, where your vacuum at, where your idle RPM is at. Very important. And then just simple screwdriver. Just really depends on what your mixture screws and your idle air or idle speed screws look like. So that's the basics of it. So now that we've got everything kind of set where we want it to, let's get this on the engine and we'll start it up, and we'll start to go through the quick procedure. So this is a really good example of giving the engine what it wants. For whatever reason, this thing didn't like having so much of that secondary transfer slot exposed. So I had to take quite a bit of it out of it to get the idle speed down. So we're kind of at operating temperature now. Let me turn the camera on and kind of walk you through it and show you step by step how to do it. But yeah, I mean, it's the same old thing with anything. You give the engine what it wants. If it wants a little bit more air, give it more air. If it wants less, give it less. If it wants a little bit more fuel, you give it more fuel. So that's the whole point of all this, is just giving the engine what it's asking for and what it needs. And when you do, you'll have a really good running carburetor. So let's go through the process on how to set the 4-corner idle mixture screws. And you can see here, just trying to make some speed adjustments or make some idle mixture adjustments to see what happened with the vacuum. And really the manifold vacuum stayed pretty consistent, which sometimes isn't out of the ordinary. Again, remember, we closed down the back side of this, so we're getting primarily most of this out of the primary side of the carburetor, but the secondary side is fueling. So again, once you switch to looking at this in the RPM range, you can kind of make those adjustments. Does it need a little bit more fuel? Does it need a little bit less? And it's best to try it both ways. Don't just go, okay, hey, it's increasing in RPM, or hey, it's increasing in engine vacuum, should be good. Always try it both ways, see how it goes. In this case, adding a little bit more fuel was the way to go. Now, we did a turn out on this one, so adding a little bit more fuel, certainly like this, but to do this we got to balance both sides. So right, we're going to do the driver's side and go back to the passenger. Now, the nice thing about doing it with this method, and again, having the tack under hood makes it so much easier, because you can kind of see it immediately as it the engine starts to hunt for the RPM that you're trying to give it, based on what you're giving with the idle mixture screws. So it's a very, very cool deal. In this case, we were able to increase the RPM by quite a bit. I think we were idling around 850 to start with, and we're up to 970, 980 here, which is kind of a cool deal. But then again, like I said, you got to kind of go back and forth a little bit. You want both sides of the carburetor equalized. You don't want just one side to be, the one that takes and adds all the speed to it, and the other one doesn't. So sometimes it's a balance of just going back and forth a few times, and you'll get it. You'll find where that highest RPM rating is, which here is like around 960, 970, and you're good to go. Now, even though we close those transfer slots down in the secondaries, we still are able to fuel it a little bit with the idle mixture screws. It doesn't change. All you're doing is just limiting the amount of air. Again, it's a little bit of a little more than a mild engine, but it's not super aggressive. And again, 4-circuit or 4-circuit or 4-corner idle carburetors are much better on a more aggressive engine, because it allows you to go through all those things. So this one was really fun, having that engine that was a little milder, that again, I hadn't tuned with this type of 4-corner carburetor before, and it made it interesting to see what the process is going to be. I know what it likes, I know what it doesn't, and again, we're just hunting to try to find that highest RPM rating, and then we can go back down and take some speed out of it, get us back down to our 850 RPM range, 840, somewhere in there, and we're good to go. And there you have it. There's really not a lot of complicated stuff to it. We set up ourselves for success by making sure all the little details up front were right. Timing's good. The fuel system's good. We know all these things because we've had this truck up and running now for a few months, and we've worked through all the little issues. But getting the carburetor, to adjust right, just makes it so much easier when you do all the other little things to make sure that you've can get the carburetor adjusted the way it wants very quickly. So hopefully that was a quick, easy little demonstration on how to do this. We haven't tuned it yet, so the power valve and the jets that I have in it, I don't know. They may be close, they may be not. I'm going to take it for a test drive here in just a little while and get the rest of it hooked up, get 700 R4 hooked up, and we'll go play with it for a little while. But for the most part, this isn't a carburetor I was planning on keeping. It's either a test carburetor or it's going to go on the website for sale. So either way, I hope that gave you some idea of how to do that. Not very complicated, pretty simple. So if you got any questions on this one, don't hesitate to leave them down below. And we'll catch you guys on the next one. We'll see you.